Well, welcome. We're about to start the final event for this year's Tanner Lectures, Perspectives for a Neo-Aristotelian Ethics by Richard Kraut. The format this morning will be quite similar to yesterday. We have two commentators. Unlike yesterday, they're two different people from the commentators you had. The first will be Professor Rebecca Goldstein at New College of Humanities in London, followed by Professor Stephen Darwall from Yale. There will be an opportunity after both for Professor Kraut to respond, and then we open the floor to discussion. I will not spend very much time myself talking about our distinguished discussants or Richard Kraut, because in previous sessions that's been done. We should leave as much time as possible for discussion, as this is the final event in this year's Tanner Lectures. So I bring you Professor Goldstein.
Thank you. During yesterday's morning discussion, Richard had graciously apologized to the discussants for having sent us longer versions of his talks than the one that he had ended up reading, overburdening us, he said. Far from being overburdened by Richard's pages, I was so intrigued by his views about well-being that I asked him to send me more pages, specifically his Appendix 1, in which he further elaborates on his ideas about well-being. It was particularly interesting to me because, as I'm sure my comments will make clear to you, I'm very much an outsider when it comes to this topic. It's not one to which I have devoted that much attention. Psychologists, too, study well-being, particularly the branch called positive psychology, which asks what are the conditions for things going right in human psychology for a change. Being an empirical discipline, psychology studies well-being empirically, trying to find correlations between, on the one hand, various individuals' stated values, their goals and projects, and on the other, the sense of well-being that these individuals report, and they occasionally try to get at it by asking them such indirect questions as, would you want your kids or other young people whom you care about to live a life much like yours? It's hard to ask people directly whether they think they're living a good life. We tend to say yes. There are various criticisms one could make against this methodology, but it's important to note that it doesn't commit the empirical study of well-being to hedonism. There are eudaimonic psychological theories of well-being that emphasize a person's sense of her own flourishing, her realizing the potentials of her nature, and that includes such non-hedonic elements as the sense a person has as to whether there is meaning in her life. Richard's theory of well-being is, however, a philosophical theory, and in it there is a distinction to be drawn, as there is not in the psychological theories, between what I guess we can call objective well-being and the subjective sense of well-being. We've concentrated so much on, because of that, I guess, contentious thesis of experientialism, on the subjectivity aspect of his notions of well-being, that I'd like to actually discuss the objective aspect that Richard claims for his notion. On Richard's theory, it's possible that a person have the sense of well-being and not really have achieved well-being at all. He can have the sense that his life is going swimmingly well, experience it as gratifyingly flourishing, and be wrong and calls such a character the deluded flourisher. There can be such a character as a deluded flourisher for Richard because his theory doesn't define well-being in experiential terms. He doesn't collapse well-being into the sense of well-being. Still, obviously, experience is not at all irrelevant to him, as witness his thesis of experientialism. There are no elements of well-being beyond those that can be experienced. Experientialism is an interesting, i.e. substantive, thesis for Richard, precisely because he doesn't define well-being in strictly experiential terms. Well-being is not constituted merely by the sense of well-being. There are such people, according to him, as the deluded flourisher. Rather, on his account, for states to qualify as components of well-being, they must, in addition to being experiential states and ones that largely feel good, also engage our, quote, nature-endowed human powers. It's this second requirement, that of engaging our nature-endowed human powers, call it the powers requirement, that prevents his notion of well-being from collapsing into the sense of well-being. It prevents his philosophical theory from simply being a disguised psychological theory suffering from the handicap of lacking all the empirical data needed to support it. Although Richard doesn't emphasize this in the lectures, an argument could be made that states that engage our nature-endowed human powers will naturally, though not logically, tend to feel good. It happens to feel good to us to develop our nature-endowed human powers. I wouldn't be just surprised if one could come up with a persuasive evolutionary explanation for why this is so. In any case, Spinoza certainly argued that this is so. Quote, when the mind regards itself and its own power of activity, it feels pleasure. And that pleasure is greater in proportion to the distinctness wherewith it conceives itself and its own power of activity. And that's from the Ethics, Part 3, Proposition 53. And he quickly follows this proposition up with this priceless remark. Quote, it therefore comes to pass that everyone is fond of relating his own exploits and displaying the power both of his body and his mind, and that men are on this account a nuisance to one another. I mean, anybody who doesn't think Spinoza has a sense of humor has not read those remarks. In any case, what Richard is committed to maintaining is that feel-good states that give us a sense of well-being need not engage our nature-endowed human powers. So a person may pursue the goal of achieving some state, say being influential, an example that Richard mentions, because he thinks it will conduce to his well-being, and maybe he does become influential, and it does result in his achieving a gratifying sense of well-being. But he will not, according to Richard, have attained well-being. He will be a deluded flourisher, and it will be the powers requirement of well-being that will have tripped him up, because Richard explains being influential, depending as it does on the attitudes that others take toward you, which is what Richard categorizes as an external thing, does not make use of our nature-endowed human powers. Quote, a human life is not made to flourish in virtue of what is external to the mind, such as the attitudes others have toward that individual, because these external things do not make use of our powers, unquote. So my initial response, and I guess also my post-initial response, is to disagree with Richard that being influential, that is, being able to persuade others and have our opinion taken seriously by those whose opinion matters to us, for example, if one is a philosopher, other philosophers, doesn't engage our nature-endowed human powers. If it doesn't engage our nature-endowed human powers, I don't know what does. It's true that the state of being influential doesn't depend entirely on one's human powers, since in order to be influential, others must have their requisite reaction towards one's exercising one's powers to, say, persuade. These requisite reactions are that external thing that, quote, does not make use of our power. So what Richard is demanding is that in order for a state to be one that engages our nature-endowed human powers, our achieving that state must depend only on our powers and nothing else. Call this the self-reliance requirement in honor of Ralph Waldo Emerson. The powers requirement, which could perhaps be substantiated, backed up by way of an evolutionary argument, gets beefed up into the much stronger self-reliance requirement, which I don't think could be argued for on evolutionary grounds. The self-reliance requirement is entangled with the thesis of experientialism because it's always possible that an external thing could escape our detection and not enter into our experience. And I suspect, and this is a real outsider speaking here, I suspect that it's the same intuition that's feeding both the self-reliance requirement and the thesis of experientialism, and that it's really the self-reliance requirement, making whether we achieve a life of well-being more a matter of what's within our control, that old Stoic idea that Spinoza also loves, that's really the wellspring, even of a thesis of experientialism, and all those extra arguments for experientialism are kind of auxiliary and supplemental. Then it's just a suspicion. In any case, I think the self-reliance requirement is just too stringent. I think that almost nothing worth pursuing depends on our own nature-endowed human powers and nothing else. But more to the point, the self-reliance requirement would, it seems to me, exclude states that Richard himself seems to countenance as being components of well-being, including, most importantly, being moral. So I'm going to confine myself to what being moral means on Richard's own terms, which terms could be disputed. On Richard's terms, for example, as we heard yesterday, one's being moral can't expand to take over one's entire life, knocking into permanent retirement other goals and projects. Richard asserts that such a usurpation on the part of the moral would be wrong. His notion of being moral excludes the possibility of what Susan Wolf calls moral saints. And I'm not sure about that. But I leave the stipulations Richard places on what it is to be moral to the side and confine myself to his conception of morality. Its context is a social one. One's being moral is realized in one's attentively nuanced right behavior toward those with whom one comes into contact. And the prudential value is that this attentiveness to all the social nuances and niceties that is required in order to do right by those with whom one comes in contact makes life more interesting. It enriches the moral person's experiences. Quote, what I want to add now, in order to show a connection between being a good person and having a good life, is that just as a connoisseur of the arts takes a deep interest in the worlds of music, painting, or literature, and thereby enriches his life, so a good person takes a deep interest in his social world and thereby enriches his experiences of life, unquote. So my worry is that perhaps this conception of morality, as relaxed as it is, so remote from the strenuous moral behavior that a Peter Singer or a Derek Parfit would demand of us, that this relaxed notion of morality necessarily involves an external thing. And to express my worry, I'm going to introduce you to a character. I've been writing novels so long that I can only think in terms of characters. I'm going to introduce you to a character with whom I've been acquainted in one manifestation or another all my adult life, and I'll call him the courtly old gentleman. The courtly old gentleman isn't some sadist of the kind that Tom had luridly painted for us yesterday, someone who experiences social situations as abundantly rich and is a keen observer of all the nuances, the better to inflict exquisite pain on those with whom he interacts, figuring out exactly the words and gestures that most wound. No, my courtly old gentleman means well. He means to do right by others, and in his efforts to do right by others, he is acutely sensitive to the details of the social situation, prominent among them the gender of the people with whom he interacts, and his experiences of the social world are all the richer for him because it is populated with the gentler sex to whom he feels obligated to attend with the full range of his cultivated solicitude. "Oh, my dear," he invariably greets me, rising gallantly and pulling out a chair for me, often complimenting me on my hair or my clothes. Let us say even that he is a professional colleague, because he very often is, someone I run into at conferences, and so his solicitous behavior is undermining of my sense of professional confidence, making me feel that I suffer from an irremediable handicap. If I look at times discomfited, the courtly old gentleman who so prides himself on picking up on such subtle cues will likely judge the look on my face to be a sign of my being unsure of myself in the high-powered setting. He might pat my hand. These are all autobiographically gathered details. He will pat my hand avuncularly, assuring me of how bright and plucky I am, and promise to take me out to dinner at the best restaurant in town as becomes a woman of my style. And over dinner, if I have not been quick-witted enough to have gotten out of it, because let me stress, and this is significant, I think, I do so fear insulting the courtly old gentleman who I know only means well, and I'm quite sure that most other women with whom he interacts feel likewise. Over dinner, he will kindly mansplain me into a suicidal stupor. The courtly old gentleman certainly thinks that he is doing right by me, and the what is it like to be-ness of him will be greatly enriched as a result of all the efforts that he is making on my behalf. His own sense of well-being will be enhanced. But of course, all the time that he is interacting with me, he will greatly be diminishing my sense of well-being, and that can't be right. Even the courtly old gentleman would agree that it can't be right. His sense of well-being would be seriously disrupted, where he's overturned, toppled, where he's somehow or other counterfactually able to be lifted out of his own experience and deposited into mine. I am that external thing, the what is it likeness to be of me and the many more like me, that makes the difference between his thinking he is doing right by the people with whom he interacts and his really doing right by them. And to some extent, we are all sadly, in our own way, in the same position as the courtly old gentleman, though we hope not so systematically getting it wrong as he, thinking that we are doing right by others, but often missing the mark because of that external thing that they are. How can there even be a notion of doing right by people with whom we come into contact, which is how I understand Richard's notion of being moral, that doesn't take into account the what is it likeness to be, the what is it like to be-ness, maybe, of the other. And that is paradigmatically an external thing, never to be represented in one's own immediate phenomenology. This is a way in which reading a novel, one in which we are immediately presented with the inner being of characters, this is the way in which reading a novel is entirely different from living a life. There are facts of the matter of which the courtly old gentleman is blissfully oblivious, and that would entirely change his own sense of how well his life is going, as we all fear that there are facts which, were we to know them, would change for the worse our sense of how well our lives are going. And that these facts would change our own life evaluations, were we able counterfactually to know them, seems to me relevant to assessing well-being, especially if one wants, as Richard does, to detach objective well-being from the mere sense of well-being studied by psychologists. Counterfactually knowing such facts, the courtly old gentleman's knowing how his solicitous attentions actually make the attendant feel, or the crackpot theorizer knowing how full of cracks his theory is, would fundamentally, existentially shake us, because it would make us feel how futile our efforts, the ones that matter the most to us, had been, that they hadn't really mattered, and so that we don't matter either, at least not in the way that we had wanted to matter, failing at the projects on which we had staked our mattering, what Bernard Williams calls ground projects, the kind that make us interested in pursuing our lives, carrying our quonitas. That's what all these various pursuits of our own well-being, our own flourishing have in common, are striving somehow or other to establish that we matter, not necessarily mattering more than others, that's an odious desire, and not necessarily cosmically mattering to the universe, that's probably an impossible to realize desire, but just enough to yield us well-being. Because what we are, we humans, are matter who long to matter. I love the polysemy of that word, matter. All right? And the projects that mean the most to us are the ones in which we try to work out our own lifelong project to matter. Incidentally, the website for the suicidal hotline, which I hope you never have reason to find out for yourselves, so is actually called You Matter, because that's what depression, the very opposite of well-being, feels like. And it seems to me that if there is any objective notion of well-being to be detached from the mere sense of well-being that the psychologists are studying, it would have to include a person's actually mattering in the way that she most wants to matter, which is what I've always thought Nozick's experience machine thought experiment is really getting at. So what kind of experience would each of us choose? My hunch is that, or at least that we, or at least those of us who are old enough to forgo having a continuous experience of eating chocolate cake, that we would all choose the kind of experiences that would make us feel that we are living lives that matter. So I probably would choose the experience of seeming to write a great piece of literature, and that this great piece of literature would do that external thing that great literature is supposed to do, namely elicit deep, enriching responses in multitudes of others. That's what a writer wants, she doesn't want the what is it like to be-ness of the writing experience, but rather to affect the what is it like to be-ness of others reading. That's why one writes. Once again, as in the case of doing right by others, the phenomenology of the other is of the essence to the mattering project of writing, and to perhaps the majority of mattering projects we humans devise. We are, after all, as you said, social creatures. In opting only to have the artificial experience of mattering, by, in my case, producing great and stirring pages that will be felt deep in the phenomenology of others, only of course they won't be in the experience machine, I would be voluntarily choosing a life guaranteed not to matter in the terms that I want my life to matter, what drives me forward, makes me get up in the morning. It's enough to worry in the midnight hours of the soul that that is the life one is actually doomed to live. Why would any of us, striving to live lives that matter on our own individually variable terms, plug into the experience machine and thereby ensure we are definitely living lives that don't matter? Instead, yielding all the mattering to those neuroscientists manipulating our experience. And that's where I end. I don't know how to end. That's all that somehow the thought of yielding all my mattering to those neuroscientists just stopped me cold. So that's it.
Well, as they say, what she said about mattering. Anyway, that's a theme that's going to come back around. Is this on, by the way? Yeah, it is on. Okay, good. Well, first, thank you very much to Richard, especially for writing such and delivering such stimulating, provocative lectures and giving us so much to think about. In his second lecture, Richard aims to consider the relation, quote, between being a good person and having a good life. I very much agree with and applaud Richard's attempt to show that virtuous activity is often intrinsically beneficial. I'm skeptical, however, that this can be accounted for solely in subjective experientialist terms. That is, in terms just of what virtuous activity is like for the virtuous agent, considered independently of what happens outside the head. To my mind, the most beneficial aspects of virtuous living frequently essentially include external factors, whether, for example, someone one was trying to aid was helped in fact, or whether one's action was actually fair or just as one was aiming to be. The experiences of virtuous activity are indeed valuable, but they're frequently predicated on agents' beliefs about how their activity fits into the world outside their heads. I would argue that often the intrinsic benefits of this activity are similarly conditional on things that are external to experience considered simply as experience, that is, as might be captured in an experience machine. Frequently, the most significant benefits depend, at least in part, on the existence and on the value of the experience's object, considered independently of the experience itself. Now, in the longer version from which Lecture 2 is drawn, Richard defines experientialism as the thesis that, quote, what goes on inside your head, your inner mental life, is all important to what makes human life prudentially good, that is, good for or beneficial for one. Richard's arguing, therefore, for the intrinsic benefits of the virtuous life entirely on experientialist grounds. Before I begin to raise some issues for this argument, let me record some surprise that Richard's thought has taken this experientialist turn. In his 2007 book, What is Good and Why, Richard argues for a broadly Aristotelian, or as he there put it, developmentalist account of well-being, according to which the good of any living thing is to be understood in terms of what enables it to flourish as the kind of thing it is, the development of its natural powers, its maturation and growth, and so on. So reckoned, well-being or eudaimonia consists in experience only insofar as the experience results from excellent natural activity. Now, as Rebecca was pointing out, the powers requirement survives in this account, but it's a necessary condition, and it looks like the presence of the other one is of the experiential condition is doing a lot of the work, and in some cases, I think, all the work. By contrast, Kraut's current experientialism seems to me less Aristotelian than British empiricist. Just as early modern and 20th century British empiricists tended to hold that knowledge is restricted to an experiential given, whether Berkeleyan ideas, Humean impressions, or sense data, so Kraut's experientialism similarly restricts well-being to what is given in experience as experience. In his first lecture, Richard argues persuasively that, quote, the quality of human consciousness, its amazing richness, variety, complexity, and depth gives human life a kind of value that's incommensurably better for us than McTaggart's oyster life is for it, however long such an oyster might live. And in the second lecture, he implicitly argues that virtuous lives generally exceed vicious ones along these dimensions, and therefore that they're better considered experientially. That is, in terms of what it's like to be a virtuous and a vicious person, respectively. The phenomenological richness and depth, that is, the richness and depth that virtuous lives seem to have to the virtuous, maybe with some caveats along the lines that Rebecca was pointing out, is what makes them better for them. Again, I'm skeptical of this claim for reasons I'll outline presently. To set up my discussion, however, I want to compare Richard's experientialist claims to those that Henry Sidgwick made on behalf of what he thought was hedonism. Now notice first that Richard takes himself to be rejecting hedonism, understood as the view that all intrinsic goods are pleasures. He says, for example, in the written version, that we're drawn to great drama like King Lear and Othello, quote, because we know that this will be a profound, disturbing experience. do we necessarily think that pleasure will be part of what we feel when we are there in the theater? I doubt it, he says. We go because we believe that our lives are enhanced by experiencing great drama and great acting. However, Richard is claiming, nonetheless, that these profound, disturbing experiences are valuable to us only because they're better as experiences, independently of their objective correlates. That's, after all, what makes the experience machine relevant. For Sidgwick, however, that's precisely what pleasure is. Sidgwick defines pleasure as, quote, feeling which the sentient individual implicitly or explicitly apprehends to be desirable, considered merely as a feeling and not in respect of its objective conditions. So roughly, positive experiences in the sense of experiences that are implicitly experienced as positive, that is, positively valuable, at the time, as experiences considered independently of anything objective that might be connected with them. It would seem then that by Sidgwick's lights, experientialism is hedonism. Granted, Sidgwick here says that pleasure is a feeling implicitly apprehended as desirable, but that doesn't do any real work in the view. More usually, he refers to what he calls desirable consciousness. For experience to be valued by the experiencer as experience, irrespective of objective matters, is what it is for the experience to be pleasure for Sidgwick. So on what grounds could Richard disagree with Sidgwick? Kraut's, of course, free to use the word pleasure in whatever way he likes, but any such difference with Sidgwick would seem to be merely semantic. It's hard to see that there's any substantive difference between what Sidgwick calls hedonism and what Kraut calls experientialism. The common claim is that the only aspects of a person's life that make it desirable for that person are experiential aspects considered independently of anything outside the head. Now, as I say, I'm skeptical of this claim, whether we call it experientialism or hedonism. As I see it, many valuable experiences or pleasures essentially depend upon our beliefs about and attitudes toward external factors. And they wouldn't have the same value or benefit us as much if those external factors were missing. The central point can be brought out by considering some remarks of Mills about pleasure and the relation between pleasure and desire. Desiring a thing and finding it pleasant, Mill writes, are phenomena entirely inseparable, or rather two parts of the same phenomenon. In strictness of language, he writes, two modes of naming the same psychological fact. Now, he makes this remark in the course of an argument for what he regards as hedonism. Because pleasure and desire are so closely connected, Mill writes that, quote, to desire anything except in proportion as the idea of it is pleasant is a metaphysical impossibility. Again, Richard understands himself to be denying hedonism and asserting experientialism in its place, but I doubt that Mill would recognize the difference. Like Sidgwick, he would count Richard's experientialism as a form of hedonism. I think we best interpret Mill's thesis that pleasure and desire are, quote, the same psychological fact if we note that pleasures, like desires, at least frequently, have intentional objects. Desire is for its object, whether what I want is to feel the warm sun on a cold day, to see King Lear, or for the drought and famine to be relieved in the South Sudan. Each possibility is something I positively regard. Mill says, I desire them in proportion as the idea of them is pleasant. That is, the idea of them as a possibility being actualized is pleasant. But this means that if these possibilities do become actualized, if they turn out as I had contemplated them, and if my positive regardings haven't changed, then what I liked as a possibility, I will like as an actuality. And that is just what pleasure is, the same positive regard toward a supposed actuality that desire involves towards a supposed mere possibility. If the objects of these desires turn out as desires, then I get pleasure. The important point for our purposes is that pleasure or the experience of positive regard from the inside has some object that's distinct from the experience of positively regarding that object. If I enjoy the feeling of the warm sun, the object of my enjoyment will be that feeling of the warm sun. Not the experience of enjoying that feeling. Of course, I can positively regard that my enjoyment as well, and so enjoy my enjoyment. If I enjoy Lear, despite but perhaps partly because of how disturbing and challenging a play it is, then the object of my positive regard is experiencing that challenging, disturbing play, and also, most likely, the performance and the play itself, independently of my experiencing it. Perhaps most strikingly, if somehow drought and famine were actually to be relieved in the South Sudan, and I come to be pleased by that, then it will be, as I suppose, that objective state of affairs, and not just my hearing about it or enjoying hearing about it, that is the object of my positive regard, as the possibility of that state of affairs obtaining was when I desired it. Now, I contend that many of our most significant positive experiences and pleasures, including most prominently those that we're apt to characterize as experientially moving or compelling or deep, essentially include attitudes toward and frequently beliefs about what we take to be external objects existing independently of our experience of them. Being moved by a performance of Lear, for example, is a response to it as a theatrical. This is a theoretical production. I'll try to keep it not too theatrical. Also, to actors performing a play written by a brilliant playwright within a literary tradition, insightfully depicting aspects of the human condition, and so on. Even our responses to more formal, less programmatic music and art seem to essentially presuppose beliefs that these are aesthetic works in specific media. So yesterday, for example, in the example that Richard gave of hearing the Bach unaccompanied violin piece, he described the sound, the qualities of the sound as artful and expressive. But of course, sound can't by itself be artful or expressive. It's got to be the production of sound by an artist that is artful and that's expressive. And I think, it's kind of essential to our appreciation of music that we're at least seeing it as that. And then I'm reminded also of David Hills's remark yesterday about encountering a painting over time and having is sort of coming clear to you what it is. I don't mean just what it's representing, but what the painting is in its own terms. Again, it seems essential to the aesthetic engagement that there's a work there that you're engaged with and that you're coming better to understand. By stipulation, these experiences might all be simulated in an experience machine with all of these beliefs being false. In one sense, it would make no difference to the person in the machine whether these beliefs were false or not. But this would just mean that it would make no difference to her experience as experience, that from the inside she could not tell the difference. And in another obvious sense, however, it could make all the difference. Even in the machine, a person could indeed care even more than anything else, whether her beliefs were true or not. And if someone cares about this, as I submit almost all of us do most of the time, it seems mistaken to suppose that the degree to which we are benefited by such experience can be completely independent of whether what we care about is realized or not, and also frequently whether it has the value that we take it to have. What about the experiential benefits of virtuous activity? Being a good person. Well, consider the kind of person that Marge Piercy celebrates in her poem, To Be of Use. The people I love best, Piercy writes, are those who harness themselves an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud, and it seems that way sometimes, in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I agree with Piercy. Those are my kind of people too. And I agree with Richard that such virtuous living has enormous experiential benefits. But Piercy's description makes especially vivid that the benefits cannot be registered in experience simply as experience. So I think we're in the region of the points that Rebecca was making about living a life that matters, that makes a difference of some kind. Piercy's people are hardly indifferent to whether they are of use. To the contrary, they harness themselves again and again in the hope that their efforts will actually bear fruit. And though they cannot, of course, know that they will, they at least try to make a difference. For them, as Piercy puts it, the thing worth doing, well done, has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Piercy's metaphor is to the contrary. Useful people need not be plodding or ox-like. They can even be cool, like Obama. But they inhabit a human world in which they show and stand up. A particularly vivid illustration of how beliefs about the external world affect the good of human life is provided by Sam Scheffler's 2012 Tanner Lectures at Berkeley, titled Death and the Afterlife. Scheffler argues convincingly that the good of human life depends significantly on our believing about the human prospect that it will continue long after our deaths. He discusses P.D. James's dystopian novel, The Children of Men, in which mass infertility leads to foreseen early extinction of the species and widespread depression and alienation. This rings true to me. Much of the significance of my life, and so the value of living it, seems to me to depend strongly on my sense of where it fits within various historical arcs, whether of family and loved ones, of colleagues and students, of beloved institutions, of community and country, and even of our species and the planet itself. It seems incredible to me that my life might be just as good for me if all of these were mere illusion. Now, Richard raises what he takes to be a significant problem for any view that departs from experientialism in holding that such external factors matter. The problem, he thinks, is that any such view has the implausible implication that the mere instantiation of the external factor, taken in itself, knowledge, for example, would contribute to well-being even if it were disconnected from any subjective experience, as, for example, when a person is asleep. But maintaining that in order to add significantly to well-being, a subjective state of affairs must, an objective state of affairs must, but maintaining that in order to add significantly to well-being, a subjective state of affairs must, at least in many cases, be appropriately related to an actually obtaining external state of affairs, does not commit one to the view that the holding of the latter state of affairs can add significantly to well-being by itself. This is a point that's come up in various comments, I think. It seems more sensible to hold that the external factor is necessary without being sufficient, that it takes both external and internal factors. This was Parfit's view in a well-known appendix to Reasons and Persons. What is good for someone, Parfit writes, is neither just what the hedonists, or we might add experientialist, claim, nor just what is claimed by objective list theories. We might believe that if we had either of these without the other, that is, either the subjective state without the objective thing obtaining, or the objective thing without the subjective state, that either of these without the other would have little or no value. We might claim, for example, that what is good or bad for someone is to have knowledge, to be engaged in rational activity, to experience mutual love, and to be aware of beauty while strongly wanting just these things. I made a similar claim in Welfare and Rational Care when I argued that some of the most significant additions to well-being are made by experiences through which we are in appreciative rapport with things we take to have and that actually do have objective value, whether aesthetic objects like King Lear, or great novels or music, or the ethically important goods the people of use aim at. So although I agree with Richard that there is an important connection between being a good person and having a good life, I'm skeptical this can be accounted for experientially, in experience considered just as experience. Central to the most significant benefits of ethically good action is both the actual realizing of the goals such action aim at, whether good consequences are intrinsically right or good acts, and their objective value. Now, in closing, it can seem at certain points that really what's at issue here is almost semantic, how to use the phrase a person's good or benefit or well-being. And that can't have any interest in its own. So I suspect the thing that's at issue is, well, what's at stake here normatively? What would follow from its being part of well-being or its not being part of well-being? Now, for my money, what matters here, the normative upshot of the concept of well-being, is what there would be justification for wanting for someone whose well-being it is for that person's sake. Okay? At one point, Richard says in the longer version of the first lecture, would you wish such a fate on your child or anyone you love? I think that's exactly the right question to ask. But when I ask that question about the kinds of situations I'm describing towards the end, that is either having a life in the experience machine that seems to be of these extremely valuable things, writing the important novel and so forth and so on the one hand, without actually doing it, no connection to reality, and on the other, actually doing it, it just seems obvious to me that that's what it would be, I'd be justified in wanting for my child, let's say, for his own sake. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Is this mic live? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you so much for those very challenging, thoughtful, and difficult questions. I will do what I can to give some response to them, but I really have to go home and think much more about these issues. So I'm very grateful to you for I'm sure this will lead to changes, I hope improvements in what I'm working on as I continue to think about it. And most of what I will say, I hope will be responsive to both Rebecca and Steve. So let me begin by the following observation. So if someone gave you the opportunity to enter into an experience machine, I would think that the right response, at least for most of us, would be a refusal to do so, simply because here we are living lives that have some value to us, and in a world in which we think we are having some good impact on other people. There are people that we want to continue to see and help, projects for the good of others, for institutions that we belong to, commitments that we've made. So this would be a betrayal and an abandonment that we, at least nearly all of us, I think, ought to and would refuse. But I think that correct reaction to the experience machine would miss something that Nozick was asking, which, even though he didn't formulate it as sharply as possible, the reaction to that refusal would be, well, you're misunderstanding the question that's being raised. It's true, you have all these good reasons not to enter the machine, but I want you to focus on the question of whether it would be good for you and simply good for you if you went into the machine and had whatever experiences you choose to have in it. So we know you refuse to go in, but for the moment, set those reasons aside and think only about your own well-being for a moment. Nothing wrong with doing that as a thought experiment. And one thing that makes the experience machine interesting and challenging is you could have precisely the experiential exposure to whatever you choose. You get to write the script for however long you are in the machine before you come out again and make another choice about what kind of experience to have. So that, I think, is why it has some attraction. You would have exactly in your life what you want. Now, my view is that people can make very bad choices about the kinds of lives that they give themselves. The fact that you choose it doesn't make it the best choice. So my example of the child who doesn't have a knowledge of what is available in life would make a very bad choice. But nonetheless, if someone had exposure and understanding of what is available in a human life, could make a better choice than that child. And there would be a certain advantage in entering the machine. I didn't bring this out in my lectures, but of course, one advantage of life in the experience machine is that there would be only so much bad, only so much suffering and pain as enhances one's life on balance. So I think, unfortunately, it's true that for many human lives, there is far more meaningless suffering than there ought to be for your good. It's part of my view that a life, it's not the best kind of life to have one which is just uniformly blissful. There's a depth to human experience that comes to us, unfortunately, through difficulty, frustration, and so on. But if we're lucky, there will be only as much of that as will, on balance, enhance our lives. Very few of us have that luck. Many people have far more misfortune, meaningless suffering, needless suffering, debilitating suffering, that diminishes the goodness of their lives. In the experience machine, if one plays one's cards correctly, if you know what kind of life to wish for, you can wish for only as much bad as is needed to create as much good as possible. So that's why I think if there's anything to be said in favor of an experience machine, that's certainly one aspect of it. So when someone comes along and says, how about going into the experience machine? And you say, no, I like my life pretty well now, and not only do I like it, but my wife is going to wonder where I am, and I agreed to be department chairman. That we're supposed to set all that aside and say, how about just thinking about you for a second? Could you make good use of this? And I think it's tempting to say, in view of the control one has over the balance of good and bad, that is a very tempting feature. Now, let me slightly shift gears. There are some experiences or activities, let me say, that we engage in that I think what we're out for really is a certain kind of experience, but we can only have that experience normally, in the absence of an experience machine, by physically engaging with reality. So a good example would be someone who likes to swim as recreation and exercise and for the usual reasons. Well, one reason to engage in swimming as a regular activity is to keep one's body in good condition. But the thought experiment of the experience machine asks us to set aside our physical condition. Let's suppose you don't have a body, and so you don't need to swim in order to prevent it from failing on you. Well, you also swim because you like the feel of the water, and you like the physical sensations of exercising your muscles. You might like the feeling of fatigue. And so on. So all of those things could be replicated if you agree. Yes, the experience machine gives you exactly the experiences that you would have in real life. You could have all of those swimming experiences without actually swimming. So one reaction you might have to this is, well, nonetheless, I want my body actually to be in the water. That's part of why I go swimming. And that would seem to me to be a very odd attitude to take towards. What difference does it make whether that body of yours is in this water? Is that really important to you? Isn't it really the experience of motion and the feel of the water and the feeling of grace, or whatever else it is that people like about swimming? Those are experiential, and they're good reasons for wanting to swim. So I would think that in reflecting on this, the right reaction would be, well, I don't actually have to get my body in the water. If I could have all of that without the physical reality of being in the water, that would be fine. Okay, now think about the inner life of an ethical person. The experience machine is supposed to be able to replicate that exactly. So you would have the same loving attitude towards others. You would feel loved by others. The experience machine would give you the illusion of having very complex social interactions, solving moral problems, and so on. Well, there's a big difference between this sort of thing and the case of swimming. In the case of swimming, there really is no reason to get your body in the water if you can have the same experience in the machine. By contrast, if you replicate your moral experience on the experience machine, you are not doing any good to anyone else. Your moral experience is not something that you value independently of whether or not it has causal efficacy on other people. You're not engaged in the moral enterprise for yourself. So you're doing it in order to improve the lives of actual people. But now we're just back to what I started talking about. We want to isolate the question of your well-being when we talk about the experience machine and say, for a moment, forget about what you can do for others and your commitment to others. Think about what would be best for you. So I think one objection that people are pressing against me is this. Their view is that the value of your moral experiences sinks to zero, or at least diminishes significantly, if in fact it is unlinked, if it has no causal efficacy outside of yourself. So on this view, there's a huge contrast between the swimming case and the moral case. The swimming case, it doesn't sink to zero that you're not actually in the water. In fact, it seems to me the right response is it's equally valuable. On the view that I think people are attracted to, by contrast, the value of moral experience sinks to zero, or at least is very, very much reduced, if in fact it is not experience that is causally efficacious in bringing about the good of other people. And I think that may be the point of most disagreement between my view and this alternative view. I don't see why there should be that difference between the two cases. So my worry is that this objection really is a version of the reaction, but you shouldn't go into the experience machine because you have a job to do here in the real world connected to these real people. So I hope that at least makes some gesture towards isolating one of the issues that we are disagreeing about. So just to reemphasize the point, if it's agreed that many of our lives, many of us would have far less needless suffering in our lives in the experience machine, is it nonetheless a good trade-off to have all of that suffering in our lives? Because in the real world, at least we can be causally efficacious in helping other people. Okay.
So we will be putting the questions on a little list. When I acknowledge you, that you can put your hand down. Take just a minute. Okay, and you want to get in a bit later, get my attention. So we'll start with Katie.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you about the experientialist defense of the moral life, and in particular to sort of re-raise this problem that you brought up yesterday about whether this relies on a sort of rosy picture
Right.
of what the moral life is like.
Right.
So if I understood your response correctly, yesterday it was to say that there's actually a virtue, or that sort of not being brought down by the difficulties of the suffering
Right.
of others, for example.
Right.
Not being crushed under that is a
Right.
virtue.
Yes.
And it seems to me that there are two different virtues in the vicinity of that virtue. So one is sort of not being crushed in the sense of not being paralyzed,
Yeah.
not sort of ceasing to act and engage.
Yeah.
The other is sort of not being emotionally burdened or not being experientially burdened
Right.
by the sufferings of others.
Right.
And it's much more obvious to me that the first one is a
Yeah.
virtue than the second, and the second
Yes.
one is what you need.
Right.
So
Right.
the worry is it would actually be,
Yes.
in some circumstances, inhuman not to treat the moral life
Yes.
as a source of unbalanced bad experiences for me.
Right. I agree. There would be someone who was heartless and simply had no emotional response at all. in the awareness of the suffering of others that by itself is a moral deficiency. Of course, there are situations in which callousness is more helpful to other people. If you are a nurse in a ward filled with suffering, wounded soldiers, it's actually going to be an advantage in your treatment of them to steel yourself and simply quell your normal emotional response. But those situations aside, it would be a defect not to feel anything. But I'm glad that you accept the point that this should be kept under control. There are pragmatic reasons for training yourself not to allow this to become debilitating. Is there a precise amount of sadness that's the right amount to feel? I doubt it. But so one can go too far in excessive reaction and too far in too little reaction. There's some kind of appropriate reaction, but there can be overriding reasons for, as I said, diminishing that for the sake of effectiveness in doing good.
Yeah, just to follow up quickly, I
Yeah.
guess my worry is that the emotional reactiveness and the sort of capacity to act are going to come apart for many people. It's totally possible to imagine someone who makes morality a central part of their life, say someone who decides to devote themselves to the problem of homelessness,
Yeah.
and for whom this is something that's a source of value, but a source of experiential, on balance, a negative experience, because
Yeah.
they're so frequently noticing the suffering of others, frustrated by the fact that other people around them don't care,
Right.
et cetera. And, on your own view, it could be worth their doing.
Yes.
But still a source of negative experiences for
Yes,
them.
I agree. So this is motivated by altruism. One realizes that it can be bad for one to have to face these painful situations. One might never become inured to it, but nonetheless reasonably believe that one is called upon to do this work, and that's admirable. And so the moral life can have that defect in it. I would hope that such a person would nonetheless be able to have some good things, and it wouldn't be all awful for that person. But so I'm not a utilitarian. I don't think that one is morally required to maximize the total good. Okay.
Tom, there's a microphone.
Thanks. So Richard, both in the lecture yesterday and in the discussion of swimming today, you've done a very nice job of showing how some activities would be as good or almost as good on the experience machine as off it. But of course, experientialism says that all activities
Right.
are as good on the experience machine as not. So I want to raise two that are more difficult.
Yeah.
So on the one side, there's achievement for me, which is a matter of setting yourself a goal and achieving it. Now, in some cases, like finding a cure for cancer or Rebecca's writing a novel that other people will read, the achievement will have effects on other people, and that invites your response that, well, the reason you prefer it is because of the effects on other people. I don't think that, for what it's worth, completely meets the intuition, because I think the intuition is that even apart from the effects, or perhaps because of the effects, it also makes your own life better, but the response is open to you to make.
Mm-hmm.
So let's consider achievements that don't have effects on other people, like one of your examples, mountain climbing.
Mm-hmm.
If you climb K2, that makes nobody else's life better.
Mm-hmm.
And on your view, the experience of climbing K2 is does every bit as much to make your life valuable as actually climbing K2.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether the other agrees. I have a strong intuition that that's not the case.
Yeah.
That what matters is actually climbing K2. That's the achievement where it's separated from any benefits for other people. And the second
Right.
one is picking up from a remark of Deborah's yesterday, because one feature of the Nozikian experience machine is that you have false beliefs on it. And you said rightly, was Aristotle's life worse because he had false beliefs about biology? And I think that's right. But there are false beliefs and there are false beliefs. And on the experience machine, you have false beliefs about where you are in the world, what your situation is. Now, I actually don't think having true beliefs about that is especially valuable.
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm in Encina Hall in Stanford. My life is fantastic. Not true. But I think on that central topic,
Mm-hmm.
having false beliefs being systematically diluted through time,
Mm-hmm.
that is a very bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't follow from the fact that Aristotle's false beliefs about the
Mhm.
laws of motion aren't a bad thing, that being deluded about something so intimately concerning yourself and your relation to the world isn't a bad thing,
Mhm.
and that the sort of dependence of the experience machine on delusion about that matter isn't a
Mhm.
serious defect in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are both very difficult questions. People rightly become attached to not only other people, but to the natural world. And so a place that has been a part of your life might be a place where you want to be, and you don't want to be in something that looks just like it, but you want to be exactly there. That's a perfectly understandable human desire. In some cases, I think the desire to conquer a very difficult mountain is connected with the feeling about the world. That an attachment to the physical beauty and whatever other, there's an aesthetic feature of this experience, and also a sense that of being at home, and that would not be something that could be replicated on the experience machine. But at the same time, these people are endangering their lives. The risk has to be there for it to qualify as something that they want to do. That's part of what is going on, is they are enlivened by the possibility that they will not return or that they will be very seriously injured. And for me, that raises the question, is it worth it if you could have exactly that experience and put into the experience all of the risk that you want, but you've arranged it ahead of time with the person who's controlling your brain, that in the end, you are going to get there. You might have a few falls. You might be very worried about whether you're going to make it. It's going to be very cold or feel very cold. That seems to me to become very close to what we want in this experience. Some people, of course, will say, yeah, but you're not actually there. But how important is it really to be there when you might die as a result, and you can get out of that on the experience machine? So I think that's part of I think there's no definitive answer to this question. I think people will go different ways on it. As to your further point about not knowing where, being deluded about where you are, that sort of thing. Again, I'm not sure how much that detracts, if anything, from one's life. So suppose you're you're very naive about the world, and you're a tourist, and you get on a plane, and you think it's a plane to Boston. Actually, it's a plane to New York. But you're so naive about what to expect when you get off the plane that you just are systematically deluded while you're there. And you think, wow, Boston is really a very interesting city. You still would have a very good experience, even though you were just mistaken about where you are. Or the same sort of example, you go into a multiplex, lots of movies are playing, and you walk into the wrong film, and you get there a little late, so you don't see that it's not the movie that you had bought a ticket to, but it's still a wonderful movie, even though you think you're seeing this movie and you're seeing that other movie. So I'm not those two seem to me to be clear cases where there's no diminution of the value of the experience because it rests on mistake. So, yes, yeah, go
I mean,
ahead.
look, if I think I'm in 67 Greenland Road and I'm actually in 69 Greenland Road, that's not a significant
Yeah, okay,
error.
right.
And even New York versus Boston isn't as big an error as I think I'm engaging with a material world.
Yeah,
I think I'm in causal contact with physical objects outside me that I'm perceiving.
Yeah.
I think I'm having causal effects on the
Yeah.
objects around me,
Yeah.
all of which are true
Yeah.
when I'm in 69 Greenland Road rather than 67 Greenland Road, or in New York rather than Boston. I
Yeah.
mean, the scope and scale of the delusion,
yeah,
of the false belief on the experience machine is of a completely
right. So would you
Different
say, you think you're reading an actual book, actually the words are coming to you because your brain is being manipulated?
I was gonna grant you that aesthetic experience,
Mhm.
aesthetic activity could be as good or almost as good.
Mhm.
And again, you're giving me a small mistake
Mhm, yeah,
about my relation to the world.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
Okay.
I won't take.
okay.
We know where we are, which is only partway through the Q&A.
Right.
Who's next?
Okay, so this is right on this point, and, I worry that sometimes if you think about just case by case, you can make an argument that, you can get the good on this example, right? But if you think about a way of life, treating your life as a receptacle for experiences seems to me to be a worse life for me than treating my life as, and not just for moral reasons, but worse for me to think of my life as a receptacle of experiences as opposed to a set of relationships, challenges, things I do with other people, and that depends on things outside myself. I think a person who thinks of their life as only a receptacle of experiences will live a worse life than somebody who, whom the experiences are often just a byproduct. Even though I agree with, you could take individual cases, but if we, now go up to the level, because that's part of what Nozick is challenging us is this a good for a person to live a life like this?
Yeah, I take the point. I don't there's an implication of passivity, which I think is not the right picture. Or it's not the picture I have. To go back to this swimming example, there are to reproduce this so that it's exactly the same experience. There is the whole array of making efforts of wanting, of intending, as planning. So the receptacle makes it sound as though the sorts of experiences are all passive. So you have to build into, for your criticism to be effective, even if there is the experience of conation, activity, cognition, and so on, still what is missing is the actual engagement with world beyond you. I just have to have a more effective response, I just have to think more. Thank you.
Hi, so I just want to return to a question raised in your lecture yesterday that brings up this point of like what's at stake with what goes into the concept of my well-being. So you mentioned the decision to have a child and thinking about, partly to think about like what would be good for me in having a child. But if I'm thinking about what would be good for my child and my child's well-being, and as you admit, the life of a lot of people is on balance for their experiential well-being, it's gonna have often more suffering and pain than the good stuff. And if I don't get to include as part of their well-being the other sorts of goods that are available in having interactions with other people, and if those goods are only goods for the well-being and the experience of the others around them, it's both selfish and on behalf of everyone else my child would interact with, like using them as a means to create them, right? Because if their well-being only gets to include their own experiences, and without the experience machine, this life gives us kind of a sucky, like on balance set of experiences, then I'm worried that you're actually pushed to a kind of anti-natalist position.
Right.
That can include in their well-being more than just the set of their experiences over a lifetime.
So you think there's more to be said in favor of having a child beyond what the experiences of the child will be as he or she goes through life. Yes, if there's, but I'm not sure how else to respond except by just not thinking in terms of the question, should one have a child, but just the general question, what are the constituents of well-being? Do they include things that are non-experiential or that depend for their value on something beyond experience? So your idea is that when you think about having a child, part of what you count as their well-being is their interaction with other people beyond their experiences.
Yeah, so all the sorts of things everyone's been pushing to put back into well-being,
Yeah.
I think if they're not in there, I'm not sure I could justify the choice
I see.
on behalf of my child.
Right.
So like I might think my
Yeah.
life on a par, like, yeah, I'll go on living it, like my
Right.
choice to make.
Yeah.
If I'm making that choice for someone else, which is what really pushes this,
Yeah.
what's at stake and the what's included in their well-being, I'm not sure if more doesn't get to go in than just the
Yeah.
experiences.
Okay, so this worries me because it sounds like you're saying, well, maybe it's justified for me to have a child because even though, in terms of her experience through life, it's going to be, on balance, pretty bad. Nonetheless, she will be interacting with other people. And so I have to put that into well-being consistence. And when I add that additional factor, her life will, on balance, be good. That the worry for me is, wait, but you're saying in terms of her experience, it's going to be lousy? That is a red flag.
Yeah, I mean, it might turn out, right, that the antinatalist wins the day.
Yes, right, okay,
It might turn
yes,
out that
right.
there's just not enough other goods. But
Right.
I'm worried that on your account,
Yeah.
we definitely have to be antinatalist unless the world gets a lot better or we actually invent the
Yeah, I'm more optimistic.
I wanted to go back to a point that I think both Rebecca and Steve brought up, and that is the sense that the neo-Aristotelian account you've given us this time seems less Aristotelian
Yeah.
than the account you gave us
Right.
in the previous work.
Right.
And as someone who's been very attracted to the Aristotelian account you gave us in previous work, the question is, what's lost? It seems to me that what's lost is the very powerful, at least for me, Aristotelian idea that good for is connected to particular kinds of natural beings and their natural capacities. So on that account, the oyster could have a perfectly good oyster life. It's not a good human life
Right.
because oysters don't have the same powers or capacities as humans. So the oyster takes nourishment, or who knows, maybe the oyster even gets to make a pearl or something. Maybe that's something that really makes an oyster life go well.
Something we can't do.
I wouldn't know. Yeah. But it's so you can imagine the oyster could have either kind of a cruddy oyster life that it, if it wanted for some reason to make a pearl, it never got a bit of grit in there, or it had a terrific oyster life in which it got to use all of the powers of oysters to the full and excellently, and so on. Now, for Aristotle, there's going to be a hierarchy between that life and a human life, but we don't really have to bring that into a neo-Aristotelian thing. We just say, all right, the oyster had a good oyster life, and we're interested in living good human lives. And then the question is, well, what is it necessary to have a good human life? And that would be to exercise human powers. And here, once again, on the Aristotelian account, that's going to be sociability and reason, but also communication. So sociability plus
Yeah.
reason and communication are what we're going to do. And it would be really exercising these real powers. And so that's, I think, the problem with the experience machine is we are not really exercising real powers because we're not actually engaging in real communication unless we have a really new version of the experience machine in which everybody else is connected to an experience machine, and pretty much we're actually really communicating with other people and genuinely being sociable with them. But in that case, maybe it's just a simulacrum of the world. So
Yeah.
it's not that. It's that we're alone in the experience machine. There is no sociability. And therefore, we are denied that, all of the use of those powers. So I would just ask in a way to sort of think about the wrongness of that from the kind of beings that I think we really are, and I think that Aristotle saw right that we really are. Imagine just for a moment, as you say, you wake up in the experience machine, and you've chosen to do this for the whole of your life, because you're pretty sure you knew how to set it up. You don't want this every 2-year interruption thing. You want the whole of your life, and yet you wake up, and you realize, I am in a vat, and I'm in a vat, as far as I'm concerned, forever, and I will never interact with a real person. My powers will not be used, and I would propose that you recognize in that moment that you're in hell. You're in the worst hell you could be. And even if in the next moment you go back in and you're having all of these sort of things, in fact, you were right to believe that you're in hell for reasons that Aristotle likely got right.
Yeah, I think of hell as a rather different sort of place, where one's senses one's senses are constantly assaulted, burning heat, foul odors, terrible noises, insults being hurled at you, a lot of negative stuff and and nothing to relieve it eternally.
Isn't it
Of course.
possible that that's wrong? Because, in fact, the worst kind of punishment that we typically give to other humans, if we want to really, if we say we're not going to end your life,
Yes.
but is to put you in solitary confinement. That is the very
Right.
worst, and
Right.
that's what you put
Right.
yourself into
Right.
in the machine.
Yes, but in solitary confinement, you don't have experiences that are as of interacting with other people and so on. And that surely helps in that situation. There is something very Aristotelian about my thinking, and that is, according to Aristotle, the highest life being led in the universe is that of an asocial being, namely the unmoved mover. And the unmoved mover has is not a member of a community, and doesn't miss it because it has no need of social interaction. And the life of the unmoved mover is filled with the most joyous cognition, because it comprehends and keeps rehearsing its excellent understanding of the whole of the universe. Or at least that's one way of thinking about the unmoved mover, and a way that at least tries to bring out what might strike Aristotle as attractive about this. So on Aristotle's view, even though it's the human situation to interact with other human beings and to develop our faculty of reasoning in our interactions with them, if we could be transformed into a different sort of being and not have a body, but instead to eternally think, we would have a better than human life. So inside the experience machine, you don't need a body, you are socially isolated. I put into the experience machine the simulacrum of a fully moral, social engagement. So the only point I'm making is that it's not as un-Aristotelian as you might think because of his conception of God. The other thing that occurs to me to say is that I want to say in the experience machine there can be as much reasoning going on as outside, because reasoning is, at least certain kinds of reasoning, are conscious mental activity, the kind that I think is valuable for us. Wondering, being puzzled over, making judgments. There is a phenomenology of cognitive life. So in the experience machine, I think reason is not impeded in any way. One can, as I was saying when I was talking about reading a physics book, all of that can occur in the experience machine, and it's much better for it to be conscious thinking than the kind of processing that goes on in our higher powers, but never rises to the level of consciousness. I don't know whether that helps, but...
Well, only that we're not God. I mean, if we were, we wouldn't be the beings we are. So that our good, if we were God, would be the good of God, would be using
Right.
the natural powers of God. But we're not that.
Right.
And therefore, to the extent to which you're speaking of a human good, we have to, I would think, exercise those human powers. You might wish you were God, or you might wish you were an oyster, but you are the animal that you are, and therefore the good that is good for you is the good for the particular kind of social, not only reason using, but social and communicative actor
Right.
that you are.
Right, I agree. It would be, Aristotle would insist you are making a terrible mistake if you think you are God and neglect social interaction, neglect your body, and so on. But he is committed to saying there is a better life than our lives, and it's one in the unmoved mover is not an efficient cause of anything, and that does not in any way detract from its life. So your objection, many people object to me, but in the experience machine, you are not an efficient cause of anything. And Aristotle is on my side. He doesn't think being an efficient cause is all that it's cracked out to be. Yes, for humans, yeah, okay, okay.
Steve would like to.
I'm going to speak on behalf of swimming. Actually, it relates to Josh's point, because it would never have occurred to me that what's attractive about swimming are the feelings as if moving through water, independently of you're actually moving through water. The pleasures of exercise involve exercise, for me anyway. I mean, you think about the childhood desire to fly, for example. We've all had dreams in which we were flying. Okay, that feels cool, right? But it feels cool. It feels cool because it's as if you're flying, right? Now, if you, so in a way, it comes back to the same issue again about, well, there's a belief about some kind of thing that you're doing. Look at me, I'm flying. Not look at me, it feels to me as if I'm flying. If it turned out that you just always weren't, then it would seem that the value for you of the experience would be less. At least so I think, I don't want to drive a wedge between the swimming example as you. Let's decide them the same way. But I decide them both the other way, yeah.
And so, but is it so your idea is the part of the value, or maybe a very large part of the value, is the actual motions of the body, which do not occur in the experience machine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
When you
why
s-
do
you
I
said the
want
fe-
my body to have swimming motions?
Because you're
what
a
I
natural
want-
being who wants to exercise its powers.
But yeah, I can do all the conation. I can decide I'm going to move my arms this way. Or actually, no arms move, but I make the decision.
Right.
I'm going to try out a new stroke, and I have all the sensory and cognitive and kinesthetic feelings that I would have in the water, but my body is not really moving. I don't have a body, and I'm not. It's not in the water. There are philosophers who think the body is just something we have to service, and Plato and Aristotle are not all that distant from that view. The body is a prison,
Right.
And so on. So yes, there's a substantive.
There's a service model of swimming,
Yes.
and there's the exercise
Right,
model
that's
of
right.
swimming.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
David.
I was worried about the swimming thing too.
Yeah.
But I'll try to approach it from a slightly different angle. Maybe because I'm not as much of a swimmer as
No,
I would like to be. The idea that I'm actually doing something like communing with water. Strikes me as part of the value, and
Mm-hmm.
it connects, I think, with with a methodological puzzle I've got about the particular way you like to bring in the experience machine. The way Nozick brings it in, as I recall, it's been a long time since I read this stuff. A lot of the questions are a lot of the thought experimental questions he asks are retrospective ones about how you might appropriately react to the news that you've been in such a machine in the past. Whereas you seem, for the most part, to think in terms of considerations favoring or speaking against the choice of going in on a given choice of programming, and prescinding from the actual responsibilities to others and things like that. And then the question which surfaces for me is, how is entry into the machine supposed to go in terms of, in terms of things like memories and background appreciation of the circumstances you're going to be in. There seem to be two ways of setting up the thought experiment: either amnesia is part of the deal, or it isn't. If amnesia is part of the deal, then how do I prescind from my aversion to massive self-deception? And if it isn't part of the deal, then how do I prescind from whatever differences in taste I have about real exercise and vegging out on video games, because a glorified video game seems to be what's on offer.
Well, no, I wouldn't think, because there's the whole availability of a certain kind of intellectual life as well, or the reading of novels, or the listening to music, or viewing of art objects, not physical canvases, but all the same impressions that can be made by real, physical canvases. So I think part of what you are assuming is that there would be not the same kinds of experiences in the experience machine, but a vastly reduced, your use of video games is your conception of what all that could be going on in the experience machine. Seems to me not true to Nozick's intention that there is everything in the experience machine that there is in real life, at least as far as experience goes, and that is not confined to a small portion of our experience. Going back to something you said earlier, as I recall, it's really the prospective point of view that he emphasizes. Would you plug in? Should one plug in? Answer: most of us, or nearly all of us, would not, and here's why. So it is framed prospectively. But look, let me, just as a side remark. In a later work, The Examined Life, he goes back to discuss the experience machine briefly, and he brings out a point that I think had not been made very clearly or at all in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He says there, if you go into the experience machine, you cannot get out. You are committed for the rest of your life to remain in the experience machine, whether you like it or not. That ruins the example. I would never do that because I might make a bad mistake in going into it, and I could never reverse course. So I think the better way of conceiving of it is what you commit yourself to is a short-term entry into the experience machine with the understanding that you don't have to return after that brief or however long period of time. That and then Nozick adds in this later discussion of the experience machine, well, of course, there are lots of things you could get out of an experience machine that would make it quite reasonable to enter it. You could learn all sorts of things that you might not be able to learn in your ordinary life. But nonetheless, he insists, but you have to decide once and for all whether or not to do this. And as I said, I think that really takes away the usefulness of the thought experiment for philosophical purposes. So I think the better way to think of it is, would you go into this once? And I think most people would say, sure, because that if I don't want to go back, I don't have to. And Nozick himself tells me there are good uses that I could make of this. So what in effect, what his view really amounts to, if you take back this stipulation that you have to make a once and for all decision, Nozick's view in the end is modified in this way: is, well, you should go into the experience machine, and maybe you should go in a certain amount of time, but don't spend too much of your time in the experience machine. So it's a not as sharp a contrast as many people assume. And so my view is that why having gone into it and made a good use of it once, why not go back again and make a good use of it again and again and again and again? Why should it be the case that one should stop doing this? One answer would be, well, you're neglecting all those people that are in your real life, but we're supposed to set that aside. So it becomes a little stranger than you might recognize at first from his Anarchy, State, and Utopia. That is this a matter of degree? Yes, a certain amount of life in the experience machine would enhance your life, but don't overdo it. And that seems strange to me to take that view. I don't know whether this really addresses what you were.
It might depend on what counts as good use.
Yeah. Yes. Well, right. Well, suppose a painting that one really wanted to see is you can't afford the plane fare to get to Paris, but it's quite cheap for you to go into this machine and have exactly the experience of it that you would have if you were standing right in front of it. That would be a pretty good use of the experience machine. Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. I've been thinking all along about how the experience machine might be similar and different to these video games that
Yeah.
people now do, in fact,
Right.
go into for 2 years at a time and come out perfectly satisfied. And I think if you do the I mean, more people now do that probably than do philosophy, right? we're actually the minority culture
Yes,
here,
right.
thinking about this. And to me, what that says is that there's actually two different kinds of objection people have to the experience machine, which don't always get clearly distinguished here. And one is more universal than the other. So I think part of what sticks in people's craw about the experience machine is the idea of having systematically false beliefs.
Yep.
And I think that goes very deep. You know, the Stoics are going to tell you that's just a feature of human nature, and it comes out in Moore's paradox and so on. And that does seem to be a bug in the machine. But so what video games offer is the possibility of entering this fictive world transparently. You
Yeah.
don't have,
Right.
you don't literally think you're an
Yeah.
eagle
Yeah.
flying on a dragon or whatever, but you still enter this world
Right.
and get all the
It's-
benefits of it. And my sense is that a lot of people around this table would still refuse that world because
Yeah.
there's something inauthentic about it.
Right.
And that I'm starting to wonder if that might actually be a philosopher's thing. A professional, I don't want to say deformation, maybe we're right, but it's a preference not that we can't take as given and self-evident for the rest of humanity. And the other thing
Yeah.
that occurs to me is, I mean, increasingly as the world gets uglier, the fictive is going to replace the real. I mean, you can't go see the Altamira cave paintings, the real ones, or the Lascaux ones. There will probably be a fake miniature barrier reef at some point to replace the one that no
Yeah.
longer exists. How do we feel about those experiences? And I think we philosophers are going to have a tough time because I don't want to see the fake cave paintings. I don't want to see the real cave paintings. But that's a preference that's actually, I think, going to start look like an elite and unaffordable one.
Right. Yeah. Good.
So, I wanted to try to come back to something that kind of came out at the end of Steve's comment about the kind of normative upshot of this. And so I think, sort of paraphrasing you, I think he said something like, well, so maybe the right way to think about well-being is that it's what you'd be justified in wanting for someone else for her sake. But I take it, since we've ruled out both egoism and utilitarianism, which are kind of the familiar ways of trying to make out of considerations of well-being a kind of systematic account of how to make choices or how to live or how it's best to be disposed, we now just have a big kind of open question about where do considerations about my well-being
Yep.
and other people's well-being and the well-being of future people, et cetera, sort of fit into the kind of question of how to live my life. And I guess I'm also sort of wondering about this in connection with the kind of original motivating idea of the first lecture, that this is to kind of capture something that you think is right in the ancients' idea that
Yeah.
the ethical life and the best life kind of fit together. I mean, it sort of seems like what you've offered us is an account according to which if I live an ethical life because of something like the experience of ethical living, I'm at least guaranteed a minimally decent life. But it's not at all clear that it's the best kind of life that
Yeah.
is the life of well-being in any way. So I just want to hear more about how well-being sort of fits into a bigger set of questions about how to live and what sorts of lives we should want for ourselves at the end of the day.
Well, it's only one. I mean, there's the right and the good. So even if we worked out the correct conception of well-being, there would be all the questions about what we, when is it okay for me to put my well-being above the well-being of someone else, under what conditions do we incur obligations to others? What are our commitments to distant strangers? None of this is going to be resolved by getting the correct conception of well-being. So it's only a part of the normative. But on any reasonable theory, total normative theory, well-being is going to, I think, has to play a very important role. And so in asking, well, what institutions should we establish? The answer is going to be institutions that serve human well-being, and then we need a conception of what that is. Another part of what you're asking for is, well, what is the if we're not egoists and if we're not utilitarians, what is the principle of right by which we should adjudicate when there are conflicts in well-being? And there, I think moral philosophy, unfortunately, can not go very far, and it requires on a lot of situational facts.
I guess, I was wondering about that, but I was also wondering more about the kind of evaluating my life, let's suppose, from the end of it and asking myself, how good of a job did I do at living it?
Yeah.
It seems to me to answer that question by saying, well, I had a lot of well-being, that just is to be an egoist, and I take it we're rejecting that. And so it really seems like you've actually moved quite far away from this ancient idea that the answer to the how well did I do at living my life and the how ethical or moral was I should be very tightly connected. That we're not getting anything like that, and we're not getting a further story about how to answer the how well did I live my life question, other than, well, if I lived it ethically, then I know it was at least minimally decent with respect to well-being.
Yeah. I mean, how well did I live my life can be a way of asking different questions. Just take a much simpler case. How well did I handle that situation? How well did I make that decision? Those are not necessarily questions about, with respect to my well-being, how did I do? So at the end of one's life, or as one sees life coming to an end, one can reflect and ask, did I do right by other people? And then it would be a further question, and just thinking of myself, did I have as good a life as I could reasonably expect? And that's the question of an individual's well-being. You can also ask, how much did I really do for my friends? Might I have contributed to their well-being in better ways than I did? So, yeah, I don't know whether that really helps, but I'm afraid that I don't have any more specific answers than that.
Now, exhausted the names on the list, and we're at the end of this session. Also, this is the conclusion of the events for this year's Hanner Lectures. So please join me in thanking both Richard for these wonderful lectures, the occasion for these experiences, and our four commentators.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.